Hello, my name is Vanessa Eberle. I'm going to speak to you about the presentation that Elizabeth Loftus did that she titled How Memory Plays Us.
This presenter is actually a psychological scientist. She's been studying memory for decades. She has to laugh when she talks to people about what she does for a living because they always ask her how they can better remember people's names or talk about their relative that has Alzheimer's. But in fact, she studies the exact opposite. She doesn't study when people forget things. She studies when people remember things that didn't actually happen. We call these false memories. Dr. Loftus starts off her talk with the sad case of Steve Titus. Steve Titus was out on a date with his fiancée, and on their way home, the police pulled over their vehicle because it sort of resembled a vehicle that had been identified in a rape case earlier that day. They also said that Steve sort of looked like the suspect the victim had described. So they took a picture of Steve and they presented it to the victim, and the victim, along with a bunch of other pictures, and she picked Steve out and she said, well, this one looks the closest. So they went to trial a few months later, and Steve maintained his innocence the entire time. But he was still convicted, because when the victim got up, she testified that she'd never forget his face, that she knew for sure that it was him. Now he went to jail, but eventually the real rapist was found, and they used DNA to clear him. Sadly, though, it had destroyed his life. He lost his family relationships, his fiancée, he lost his job, and so he decided he was going to go back to court to try to rectify the damage done. Sadly, in his case, though, a few days before he was supposed to go to court, he died of a heart attack that was induced by stress.
How wonderful it would be if Steve Titus's case had been an isolated incident, but that is not the case. In fact, she was talking about a study that they did where 300 individuals had been wrongly convicted. They were later able to use DNA evidence to prove their innocence. Some of these people were even on death row. They lost 5, sometimes 20 years of their life. Collectively, they spent 4,000 years in jail. The crazy connection between so many of them was that 3/4 of these convictions were based on an eyewitness testimony. Memory has a common misconception of being like a recording device. It is sadly not just an objective observer. It's not something you can just hit replay and come back to and have the exact same experience that you had. According to Loftus, what memory really is constantly recreated. You pull it up, you look at it, you unconsciously make a few little changes and you put it back. She likened it more to a Wikipedia page where you change it, and sadly enough, others can also change it. Sometimes these changes occur because of misinformation contaminating it, such as a time when you talked about an event to other people and they talked about how they had perceived the event, and their influence can change what you have in your memory. Also, having media coverage talk about the same event constantly will change the perception and what you believe actually happened. One way that things get contaminated is through priming. Loftus did a study where they showed people pictures of a car crash and then they asked them leading questions. Sometimes they used the word hit and sometimes they used the word smash. If they had said the word smash, then people reported that the cars had been going faster. They also asked them if they had seen the broken glass. The people who were given the word smash were far more likely to have seen the broken glass, even though the broken glass did not exist. They also mentioned seeing a yield sign when they were suggested that there was a yield sign, even though it had very clearly been a stop sign in the picture. One of the criticisms that Loftus faced was, well, but surely in a stressful situation you would remember the details. So she found a situation where soldiers were being trained for interrogation, that they would be interrogated if they were to become prisoners of war. They found that in that incredibly stressful situation, in the aftermath, the soldiers were incredibly susceptible to suggestion. In fact, they were so susceptible that they regularly misidentified their interrogator, even when this interrogator looked nothing like the other person. Loftus noticed a trend in the 1990s that she found to be very troubling. People were going to psychotherapy for help. They were going in with problems like depression or anxiety, but they were emerging with more serious problems. In these sessions, she realized that the therapists, whether intentionally or not, were planting the ideas for memories. They were using techniques like exploring repressed memories or sexualized dream interpretation, and by these suggestions, the clients were able to create entire memories for things that had no evidence of ever existing. So Loftus decided she was going to really study about this. So she brought in some volunteers to participate in this study, and she convinced them of a situation where they had been lost in the mall. And they were crying and they were very upset, and then an elderly person stepped in to help them, and they were ultimately reunited with their family. About a quarter of the people in her group decided that yes, this had really happened, and they managed to create entire memories about it. They filled in all the missing details, but it had never actually happened. The critics looked at the study and said, so what? That happens all the time. People get lost constantly. That's not very impressive. They could just draw on the experience of other people. So a lab down in Tennessee decided that they would try their own hand at it, and of their participants, they'd managed to convince a third of them that they had had an experience when they were a young child where they had nearly drowned. In Canada, they managed to convince half of their participants that they had been attacked by a vicious animal. And in Italy, they managed to convince some of their participants that they had actually witnessed a demonic possession. Now, obviously, if you believe that you've almost drowned or you've been attacked by a vicious animal, it's going to have some lasting effects. So to study these kind of effects, they decided to try it out, convincing people that they had had a negative experience eating certain foods. So strawberry ice cream or eggs. And they found that these people, they didn't really want to eat eggs or strawberry ice cream. That obviously that was something that they didn't like because they'd had a bad experience, even though that experience had never actually happened. They also managed to convince these people that at some point they had had a positive experience with a food like asparagus. And so people were more willing to eat asparagus. So she was pointing out that this behavior has long-lasting effects after the memory has been planted. Loftus then thought that it might be useful to be able to plant memories in children to foster a healthier lifestyle. That you really do like these vegetables and you really do like exercising. You've had very positive experiences with them, even if those hadn't actually happened. Now, the critics came in screaming about how terrible it was that she would dare suggest the parents lie to their children. Her response was, Santa Claus, anyone? Now, because she has this experience with false memories, it allows her to be far more tolerant with the memory errors that we all make. That her loved ones that forget or inaccurately remember, she is okay with. She doesn't get upset about that. She also realizes that though many people cherish their memories and that's a big part of who they are, she realizes that there's a lot of fiction in hers and others. So this leads to questions, like how can we use this information to prevent more wrongful convictions? And how can we educate the public that the memory isn't what it appears to be? We also might call into question that because of these false memories, how does it influence those accounts that we have of history? And that concludes my summary of Dr. Loftus's account about how memory plays us.